Hello, I am Baal Kadmon, and I'd like to thank you for watching and or listening to this podcast. I hope you're doing well. I've been very busy with various different projects, one on set, one on Pazuzu, one on the Gen, and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's been really busy for me. And I also have quite a few emails that I need to respond to and a lot of questions on a range of different topics. So recently, I received a question about my latest book, The Messianic Mirage. Not many people know about this book yet, but it explores the idea that Jesus is unlikely to fulfill Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. Now, it's a bit controversial, but I present the case, I think, pretty thoroughly. So if you're interested in that book, you can find it in the link in the description. Now, one of the questions I received this weekend was about the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi. And of course, it's perfect timing, right? We're entering the Christmas season. So they asked whether such a story would add or detract from the Jewish concept of the Messiah. Now, I argued that this story is not rooted in Jewish tradition at all and likely would not be seen as evidence for supporting Jesus' messiahship, and let me explain why. Now, before I do, please note that I'm not claiming Jesus didn't exist or that the words attributed to him lack any spiritual depth. I'm not saying that. My discussion here is purely scriptural and historical, sort of focusing on the idea of messiahship that is associated with him. So with that, let's get to the heart of this podcast. So let's look at the story first in the book of Matthew about the Magi and the Star of Bethlehem. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, I want to add something to this. The book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, is often referred to as the Gospel of the Jews because it supposedly aims to lay the groundwork for proving Jesus' messiahship to a Jewish audience. However, I will say I believe it falls short in achieving this, and I'll explain why. So the Gospel of Matthew's account of the Magi following a star to find this newborn Jesus represents really a significant departure from Jewish religious sensibilities of the time. And oh, by the way, we always say that there were 3 Magi, but in fact, as you saw, the text actually doesn't tell you how many there were. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. So as I was saying, the Gospel of Matthew's account of the Magi and the following of the stars is to find Jesus is a really huge, significant departure from Jewish sensibilities. So when we examine Jewish texts from this period, we find consistent warnings against this very practice that is celebrated in this narrative. I mean, even, the Torah, right? From the 5 books of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy states that they forbid divination and astrology. It states in chapter 18, verse verses 10 through 12 of Deuteronomy, it says, "Let no one be found among you who interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord." Yet the Magi's story centers precisely on foreign astrologers who are using sort of celestial divination to find the Jewish Messiah, which is already weird enough. So this disconnect becomes even more apparent when we consider contemporary Hellenistic birth narratives, right? Because remember, this is during a Hellenistic period. So for instance, Suetonius tells us that before Augustus's birth, there were celestial signs interpreted by priests, and similar motifs appear in other stories, such as the stories about Alexander the Great. The philosopher Diogenes Laertes records that Zoroaster's birth was also heralded by astronomical phenomena. So these parallel accounts suggest that Matthew's narrative sort of draws more from Hellenistic literary conventions rather than Jewish tradition. And think about this. Consider how unusual it would have been for Jewish religious leaders to accept guidance from foreign priests practicing astrology. The Magi, who were either likely Zoroastrian or Babylonian priests, would have been viewed with deep suspicion by Jewish authorities, and even more so by like Mary and Joseph. I mean, you have these people coming out that are clearly not Jewish, presenting gifts to you because of your son. This is very irregular. Now, the Magi's practices, the reading of celestial signs and practicing divination, were exactly what the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah had condemned. And these are the same prophets that are used to, quote unquote, prove Jesus' messiahship, which I told you before is not true, and I cover that in my book, The Messianic Mirage. But yet in Matthew's account, these foreign priests are portrayed as having greater spiritual insight than Jerusalem's religious authorities. Greater insight. So this reversal makes perfect sense if you're looking at it from a Hellenistic context, where wisdom was often portrayed as coming from, quote unquote, exotic foreign sources, but would have been deeply problematic in traditional Jewish settings. I mean, very, very problematic. They don't even do it today. And also, the gifts brought by the Magi also reinforces this Hellenistic perspective. I mean, gold, frankincense, and myrrh were standard gifts in Persian royal courts and Hellenistic ruler cults. While not explicitly forbidden, accepting these types of gifts from, I guess you could say they were pagan Magi, pagan priests, would have raised serious concerns in a Jewish context. So, compare this to how the prophet Daniel, while serving in a foreign court, carefully avoided accepting gifts that might compromise his religious integrity. But the Magi story shows no such concerns. So it suggests that its author was writing from a Hellenistic rather than a Jewish perspective. Now, the symbolism of these gifts also deserves a little bit of a deeper examination. So they weren't just random. These are not random gifts, but these are very specific and symbolic, especially in Hellenistic culture. So gold represents divine kingship in Hellenistic ruler cults. Frankincense was associated with divine worship throughout the Mediterranean world, particularly like even in Egyptian temples. And myrrh had strong connections to Hellenistic mystery religions used in their initiation rites. So these associations would have been very familiar to Hellenistic readers, but potentially problematic for Jewish audiences who might see them as associated with pagan worship. So and also something interesting, when you read the text, remember it said that Herod was sort of disturbed by this. It's interesting the response of Jerusalem to the Magi's news also. It says, Matthew reports that all Jerusalem was troubled along with Herod at the Magi's announcement. So this universal anxiety about messianic views would be really unusual in a Jewish context, where messianic announcements typically brought hope rather than fear. So it really fits the Hellenistic narrative patterns, where divine signs often brought initial terror before their positive meaning was understood. Now let's move to the star. Now the star itself behaves in a way that sort of reflects a Greco-Roman astronomical concepts rather than Jewish ones, right? So when Matthew describes the star as stopping over Bethlehem, he uses the terminology stenai, or to stand firm. And this is a very familiar term in Hellenistic astronomical texts. Jewish texts barely use stellar phenomena as a messianic sign. And when they did appear, such as in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, where Balaam or Bilam prophesies the star from Jacob, that was a metaphor. It was metaphorical rather than a literal astronomical event. Here, let's read from that. Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. Bilam says, "I see him, but not here and now. I perceive him, but far in the distant future. A star will rise from Jacob, a scepter will emerge from Israel." Now, in Hellenistic culture, the appearance of new stars or celestial phenomena was commonly interpreted as announcing significant births or deaths. But this was metaphorical in the book of Numbers. Now, Pliny the Elder, for instance, discusses several such occurrences in his natural history about new stars appearing, foretelling of births and deaths. Now, the way the star behaves also reflects specific Hellenistic understandings. Hipparchus had developed sophisticated models of stellar movement, and when Matthew describes the star as going before the Magi and standing over Bethlehem, he uses technical terms from Greek astronomical writings. So the idea of a star moving and stopping this way makes more sense in the context of Greek planetary theory than in Jewish celestial understandings. So Greek astronomers recognized that wandering stars could appear and stop in reverse direction. I guess we call it retrograde, right? So the narrative's universal implication really would have been foreign to Jewish messianic expectations. So while Jewish prophetic literature sometimes envisions non-Jews, or as they call it, Gentiles, acknowledging Israel's God, the idea of pagan priests using their own religious practices to recognize the Jewish Messiah would have been very unusual. Yet this fits perfectly, though, with Hellenistic religious syncretism, where different religious traditions were often seen as various paths to the same divine truth. So we see this approach in Hellenistic writers like Plutarch, who readily identified equivalence between Greek, Egyptian, and Persian deities. Another interesting thing is the geographical elements of the narrative, right? And that also reveals a very Hellenistic perspective, that the Magi come from the east. And that is a phrase that in Hellenistic literature often signified quote-unquote exotic wisdom. So we had, Greek philosophers like Pythagoras were frequently credited with gaining their wisdom from Eastern travels. So the journey motif itself, wise men traveling great distances in search of truth, is a common Hellenistic literary trope. I mean, let's consider Apollonius of Tyana, whose journeys to the east in search of wisdom parallel aspects of the Magi narrative. And this really contrasts from the Jewish understanding, because in Jewish traditions, wisdom was typically associated with Israel itself, and particularly Jerusalem. It didn't come from the east. It didn't come from somewhere else. Another interesting thing is the timing of the star's appearance also reveals a Hellenistic element. The Magi's calculation of the child's age based on the star's appearance reflects Hellenistic astrological practices. And these Greek horoscopic astrology became sophisticated by the 1st century BC. So they were showing that as well. And Jewish sources, when they discuss celestial events at all like this, rarely attempted such precise astronomical timing, and at least not at that time. Now, I think what's really important here is the political subtext of the story. And this also reflects a Hellenistic rather than a Jewish concern. The contrast between the wise foreign priests and I guess you could say, the duplicitous Herod follows a common pattern in Hellenistic political literature, where foreign wisdom often serves to critique local power. So this mirrors, for instance, Plutarch's use of Egyptian priests to critique Greek politics in his treatise on Isis and Osiris. So while, Herod was paranoid and he was violent, some people say that he may have had parasites in his brain, and that's why he became so crazed. But the fact that he was paranoid and violent, those portrayals of him are things that you do see in Hellenistic tyrant narratives. So you'll see these stories appear in Herodotus, and where Eastern wise men often interact with Western rulers, usually to the ruler's detriment. So we see this as well. But what is really glaring to me is the absence of certain Jewish elements in the telling of this story. There's no mention of the Magi converting to Judaism or accepting Jewish law, which would typically be expected to happen. I mean, they're saying this is the Jewish Messiah. They don't convert. Which is unusual. Why wouldn't they? Right? Why wouldn't they if he is the Son of God? They remain. There's nothing suggests that they then became Jewish. So the story shows no concern for that type of stuff, for ritual purity issues that would normally arise from close contact with non-Jewish priests. These omissions suggest that the author and the audience were concerned with Hellenistic ideas and not Jewish ideas. It's just the narrative connects to a wider Hellenistic philosophical ideology and not Jewish at all. Now, to the early Christians, the early Christian reception of this narrative reveals also its Hellenistic character. 2nd century writers, especially Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, they both interpreted the Magi's story through explicitly Hellenistic philosophical framework. They saw the Magi as representing the best of quote-unquote pagan wisdom bowing before Christian truth. So it's a very Hellenistic way of incorporating previous religious traditions into a new synthesis. Now, it's interesting to note that the tension between the narratives of the Hellenistic elements and the traditional Jewish thought has led some religious groups to question the divine origin of the star itself. Yeah. I mean, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, right, have argued that the star was actually a tool of Satan rather than God, pointing out that it served to reveal Jesus' location to his potential enemies. They note that if the star was divinely sent, it paradoxically aided Herod's violent intentions by alerting him to Jesus' birth. So this interpretation aligns that the interpretation that actually the star would actually be an evil thing would more align with the traditional Jewish warnings against astrology and divination, viewing the star as a part of a quote-unquote pagan rather than divine system of guidance. So as you can see, the story, the whole narrative of the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi is just something that just doesn't make any sense in a Jewish perspective. And the fact that the book of Matthew is called the Gospel of the Jews, or to the Jews, is, it doesn't make any sense. The people who wrote the Gospel of Matthew clearly had more Hellenistic ideas. They didn't have many Jewish sensibilities at all. And I sort of make that argument in my book, The Messianic Mirage, where, I take apart certain elements, and it just goes to show you that some of the writers of the New Testament, I don't even think they knew much about the Old Testament. If they did, a lot of what they wrote they wouldn't have written it, a lot of it, because it doesn't make any sense. If these people were, the writers, even the writers, I couldn't even imagine that they were even Jewish at all. And because if you read the text carefully, you see that they don't know certain things that you would think they would know if they were Jewish. So this whole narrative is questionable, and I say it completely detracts from the Jewish, the Christian idea that Judaism foretells Jesus as the Messiah. It just doesn't make any sense. But there you have it. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. It's a little long, and again, don't shoot the messenger. Now, I just want to say that although this isn't a chapter from my book, The Messianic Mirage, if you are interested in learning more about why I believe Jesus is unlikely to be the prophesied Messiah in the Old Testament, you can grab a copy of my book at the link provided. And I do hope you enjoy it. It's a little bit long, but I go into pretty great depth on almost every single verse that the New Testament writers use from the Old Testament. I go through and analyze and break it down and show you why it doesn't apply to Jesus and may not even apply to a messianic idea at all. So anyway, if you're interested in that book is called The Messianic Mirage, and the link is below. So with that, that is the end of this podcast. I will speak to you soon. So mote it be.